Capitalist realism is the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economical system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. Mark Fisher coined this term in his book, Capitalist Realism. One can observe this as a development or completion of the encircling of our political horizon by the end of history narrative that was celebrated after the fall of the Soviet Union. Made famous by Francis Fukuyama in his essay, The End of History and the Last Man, this was the notion that liberal capitalist democracy is the ultimate system of management, and any improvements to society would be achieved from internal reforms in such a system. It was, in his words, the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. This victory of capitalism over other forms of thinking is encapsulated by the victory of neoliberalism in the sphere of socio-economic, political, and cultural discourse. Neoliberalism in the last 30 to 40 years has created a paradigm whereby markets become the fundamental basis for understanding everything and for performing any social or even personal task. Neoliberalism sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. It redefines citizens as consumers whose democratic choices are best exercised by buying and selling, a process that rewards merit and punishes inefficiency. It maintains that the market delivers benefits that could never be achieved by planning. Attempts to limit competition are treated as inimical to liberty. Tax and regulation should be minimized. Public services should be privatized. The organization of labor and collective bargaining by trade unions are portrayed as market distortions that impede the formation of a natural hierarchy of winners and losers. Inequality is recast as virtuous, a reward for utility and a generator of wealth, which trickles down to enrich everyone. Efforts to create a more equal society are both counterproductive and morally corrosive. The market ensures that everyone gets what they deserve. As Margaret Thatcher once said, there is no society, which is to say that she was peddling this notion of every individual automatically being first and foremost a rational consumer. This view, of course, doesn't take into account the fact that humans have barely been living like this for a fraction of a second on the grand historical timescale. It is ahistoric. And also, it does not take into account things like hegemony and manufactured consent. It is within this neoliberal political space that capitalist realism comes into existence as a concept. Capitalist realism is also present in cultural products, such as television shows that consciously or unconsciously recreate the same neoliberal understandings of space-time and political economy that has pervaded all aspects of society. For example, the show The Good Place, as its premise, has the idea that when people die, they go to the good place, or the bad place according to their overall scores, a sort of karma total. What is interesting in this show is that it explains how every good place has its own manager, who is an angel, devils being the managers of individual bad places. The almighty power that the angels have to shape the society in any way imaginable should have been a premise that would have allowed all sorts of new ideas to be explored, as the possibilities were literally endless thanks to the power of the angel. However, the chief manager of this good place is an old white male in a suit who has a female assistant, works like an HR executive to mediate social issues between individuals, and replicates other such bureaucratic functions that are emblematic in the neoliberal horizon. Even when given the opportunity to have complete control over imagining a radically different and new society, the creators of the show, whether consciously or not, recreate the conditions of the modern workplace and see it as a model fit to be heaven-like. Marxist thinkers such as Friedrich Engels and Rosa Luxemburg, among others, have provided analyses of how capitalism makes workers recreate the conditions of their work in their immediate microcosms, such as the family and friendly relations. Marxist feminism looks at the division of labor within the household and focuses on the unpaid labor of women in a patriarchal society that is used to reproduce the male-dominated labor force for the market. The The state of capitalist realism that Fisher argues exists today is a far accelerated model of this process of striation of individual and collective space under the commands of our vampire friend, Count Capital. Fisher points out that living in the 21st century feels like living in the 20th century but with high-speed internet. Think about that in terms of, say, Bernie Sanders discussing how in terms of adjusting to inflation, real wages have not risen since 1970s. Meanwhile, productivity has skyrocketed. What does that mean? Basically, that the surplus value derived from labor is being more and more absorbed by those who don't do labor themselves. Anand Girdhar Das, in his book Winner Take All, also talks about this in a similar temporal vocabulary. The 1% gets to live in the present and future, while the rest are stuck in 1979.
Think about it this way. In every year in this country and in all countries, a certain amount of future reigns on all of us. A certain amount of progress reigns on all of us. A certain amount of innovation reigns on all of us, right? Innovation, the Latin word for new stuff. And the question then becomes, when that new stuff, the future, progress reigns on us, who gets it? Who harvests the rainwater? And what has actually happened is the future has become a thing that is privately gated and enjoyed and monopolized by very few people. Which means that you can be living in an age where extraordinary things are being invented, the internet is being invented, medical advances are happening. But if you are not in the gated community that enjoys the fruits of the future, you are stuck in 1979. And that's true as a matter of wages for many people. It's true as a matter of health access for many people. It's true as a matter of information access for many people who are listening to media that is distorting their minds.
The stifling of the future has always been a condition of capitalism. Capitalist realism works under the logic that what counts as realistic, what seems possible at any point in the social field, is defined by a series of political determinations. An ideological position can never be really successful until it is naturalized, and it cannot be naturalized while it is still thought of as a value rather than a fact. Neoliberalism has sought to eliminate the very category of value in the ethical sense. Capitalist realism has successfully installed a business ontology in which it is simply obvious that everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business. Capitalists love talking about pulling yourselves up from your bootstraps. They love saying, oh, it rewards those who put in the hard work. So, are the nurses and doctors who are currently at the frontline response of coronavirus going to become millionaires by the end of the crisis? Well, there's that. Today, an entire generation that knows nothing other than this unipolar world of globalized capitalism is finding its footings and seeing that the limits on their imagination are actually very directly connected to the economic interests of a certain class. In terms of some big moves, we've seen how quickly countries have acted to provide security to people who are very precarious. But of course, it also shows how little this system can provide. So, while the US government pumped $1.5 trillion into the economy, it is saying that it might be able to provide some relief money to its common citizens by the end of April, maybe. That's a whole another month in a country where something like over 60% of people don't have $400 set aside for an emergency. Spain has, for example, nationalized all its private hospitals. What does that say? It says what everyone inherently knows, that when it really comes to providing healthcare or any other such basic needs-based services and goods, private sector is useless, because unless it can churn a profit out of it, it won't bother moving. Countries like France and the USA saying that evictions will be halted, and there might be some support for or even suspension of rent payment temporarily, just tells you all you need to know about the fact that we could have always chosen to feed and clothe people and give them shelter. It's almost as if they're saying, well, it's a tough time, so let's temporarily give you the things we otherwise withhold on penalty of starvation and homelessness. Angela Davis has a nice quote about this scenario, I think. The idea of freedom is inspiring, but what does it mean? If you are free in a political sense but have no food, what's that? The freedom to starve? Again, think about the fact that Michael Bloomberg spent $700 million to lose a primary. And where is he now? Where are all the billionaires who love doing philanthropy. Bill Gates doesn't even need to finish snapping his fingers in order to pump some money into making hospitals overnight like China did, and it would still total up to be spare change for his overall fortune. And we don't even have to get to the big picture stuff just yet. Even small demands like local rent strikes or halting evictions are radical breaks, particularly for places like the US, as people realize the role of landlords in their economy. One story I would encourage people to read is about how 12 homeless families in LA have taken over empty houses so that they can be safe during this pandemic. We need to move beyond thinking in a strict sense of what is realistic when we know that who defines what realistic is a small percentage of people benefiting from this reality. The fact that this crisis has created major problems for stock markets and in general supply chains across the entire world shows the weakness of this supposed all-powerful system. The fact that already so many people are losing their jobs, or in many cases getting 0 hours while places are shut down and governments have to step in and spend trillions for 20 minutes of stock trading, or almost another trillion in the US on giving people direct checks, would suggest that instead of being the only social system that works, capitalism is inherently dysfunctional, and that the cost of it appearing to work is very high. Now, a quick note on some people using socialism or communism too freely as a way to explain basic government intervention in a time of crisis. This is something to watch out for because it is important to realize what those things actually are. By obfuscating the two, socialism, communism, and on the one hand with government interventions, we're basically saying something to the extent of, well, it's socialism when the government does stuff. We are almost parroting the ignorant caricature that libertarians paint of socialism being equal to big government. It reproduces the ideology of thinking that socialism simply means broad-scale authoritarian control that can be useful as a system to manage centrally during periods of crises. With this obfuscation, we are actually going even further away from any chance at socialism by accepting that whatever is happening within the confines of a big liberal welfare state is itself socialism. At this point, in this way of thinking, we are still within the end of history framework. Instead, those of us on the left should use this time to help define clearly to people the distinctiveness of socialism from mere liberal or even social democratic reforms. The fact remains that socialism is a broader world historic epoch that is yet to arrive because the material conditions necessary for such a world are not yet in place, which is a democratic economy, the democratic ownership of production. Marx and Engels and even Rosa Luxemburg talk of the choice humanity has between socialism or barbarism. And it is important to remember that just because great things might be happening doesn't mean that they will necessarily happen in one progressive way. It can also be a situation where we end up in the ruin of the contending classes.